Well, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. This is the second of four discussions of the Declaration of Independence. The last one you had was on women and the Declaration. This is, of course, slavery and the Declaration on Thursday, 5 o'clock in Receiver 100. We'll have a dissection of the actual Declaration itself. And then on the 25th, we'll have our final event, and that is with Jessica Levinson of the law school. She'll talk about the Declaration, rule of law, and the limits of democracy. So I invite you to go to that. Will be in Almonds in 90,000. I want to thank the BCLA team that helped us organize and sponsor this, and Dean Ricky Fox, who helped pay for everything. Today's panel deals with slavery and the Declaration. And unless anyone mistakenly think that it's old news, all you need to do is look at CNN and you'll find that, for example, you have a president who is sending social media about Barack and Michelle Obama as apes. And so while this is a question that was central and key, the time of the Declaration, it is just as important in our day. Because as far as we've come, we now know how far we have to go. I want to thank again to all of you for coming. A terrific panel. The third panelist is on her way. And I'll just introduce you to the chair, and she will introduce each of the panel presenters. Cheryl Brills, recently retired Professor Emeritus of LMU, the Department of Biopsychological Sciences, critical psychologist, one of the most highly regarded, accomplished, and successful faculty members in the history of the university. And one of my favorite people. She is just a superstar. And I said, I really was seeing. She goes, I'm here all the time. So bless you for that. Thank you. So I will turn this over to you and ask you if you want to introduce the panel, and let's get started. Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Okay, I was about to make you do it again, but you had some strong voices in the front. So it is a pleasure and it's an honor, and it is particularly timely to have this conversation about the Declaration of Independence. I'm joined by two members of the faculty, Professor Chaya Crowder, who is an associate professor here at LMU in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. She received her PhD from the Department of Politics at Princeton University, where she also received certificates in African American Studies and Gender and Sexuality Studies. Her research, Dr. Crowder's research and teaching interests includes political behavior, race and ethnicity politics, social media, and American politics, as well as gender and American politics. She recently published a book with Oxford University Press entitled Intersectional Solidarity, Black Women in the Politics of Group Consciousness. Also with us today, and by the way, Dr. Crowder will talk about the ways in which we have contested citizenship and continually fight for rights in this country. The Constitution had ignored us. Professor Marne Campbell is professor and chair of the Department of African American Studies here at LMU. She received her PhD in history at UCLA, my alma mater also. So I got my PhD and the D. And, come on, y'all, lighten up. I said my PhD and the D. And she holds a master's in African American Studies. Dr. Campbell won the Los Angeles City Historical Society Miriam Matthews Ethnic History Award for her book, Making Black Los Angeles, which is on UNC Press, published in 2016. She's also published essays in the Journal of Urban History, the Journal of American History, the American Studies Journal, and the Journal of African American History. She has written a legal and social history on the need for reparatory justice in California, which will be out in early fall 2027. And she's working on another book about crime and punishment in early Los Angeles. And I had the pleasure of working with her as a subject matter expert. I was on the California Reparations Task Force appointed by the governor of California, and she provided expert subject matter material for our final report and the income or just the final. Yeah, for both. Yeah, okay. All right. So, and she is going to share with us some background information on the three-fifths concept and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment of the Constitution, which is connected to the Declaration. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Campbell. Bye bye. So, should I praise you another tier or should I go here? Is it okay? Can we be relaxed and sit? Can y'all see us? Okay.
Okay. Well, hi everyone, and thank you so much for coming service panel. And I can't tell you enough how important this is that we are discussing this, that we are discussing it now. A very, very timely topic, not just for the anniversary, but just everything that is going on, even within the last 24 hours. And I haven't checked any headlines since this morning, so I don't know what's happened today. But I frequently check the headlines because I'm like, that seems fishy, or that happened, or we got to know about this. So I want to start just by, as Dr. Grills said, and thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Grills. I just want to start by kind of focusing on the changes that occurred sort of from the time of the Declaration of Independence into the Constitution, because a lot of this, a lot of what we know today, especially in terms of race, stem from slavery and the story of enslaved people in this country, but also are very much connected to the debates around the Declaration of Independence. So this is just a rough timeline that I wanted to kind of give us that I'll be highlighting. 1776 is the Declaration of Independence, and 1783 is the end of the American Revolution. And these dates are quite important, and I'll just kind of brush on them in a minute. And then immediately after the American Revolution, we have the foundations of the Constitution and the end of the transatlantic slave trade to the United States and what becomes the United States. But in that 20-year time period, it is the peak period of enslaved people being brought into this country, or the mini nation, as it was often referred to. Um, I put 1861 to 1865 up there so everybody notices that is the Civil War in America. And so what comes out of the Civil War are lots of compromises that all stem from slavery. But when you think about, and some of you already know, that in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence and then again in the Constitution, the word slavery or the word slaved or enslaved are intentionally left out because people did not want to be considered hypocrites for using the words and saying, here we are, here a bunch of slaveholding nation. The majority of people, especially in the American South, so before even the Constitution is ratified, a lot of people were a slaveholder all the way up and down the East Coast and all the colonies. So, as a result of the American Revolution, um, the states that board in the North almost immediately or figure plans to progressively manumit the enslaved populations there, and then slavery becomes um, concentrated predominantly in the American South. So I want to talk about some of the things that happened legally, including the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, and then the 1340 and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. So it's a big jump in time that I realize that, but I want you to think about from the 1780s to the 1870s, you had this time period of um, lots of uneasiness and unrest in terms of status for people of African descent. The other thing to think about it as well is that there was a lot of debating over the Constitution, the drafting and the ratification over what we were going to do about the institution of slavery. So, I just mentioned that most people of African descent in the North were freed by 1800. And then in the new nation, there were a lot of forces favoring slavery that were stronger than those favoring emancipation. So the debate about slavery and emancipation was there early on, but there were many more voices and many more supporters of the institution of slavery. It was very strong in the South, and it fully thrived and expanded. Between 1781 and 1789, the Articles of Confederation were drafted, and they actually provided for a weak central government. And so people were very concerned about what their rights were and what that meant in terms of the government. And so they decided to create a new constitutional um, convention that met in 1787. And this then gave central government power um, to regulate commerce, taxes, and enforce laws in the states. The convention also had to make important concessions to Southern slaveholders. So again, they needed to come up with agreements that they could appease the slaveholders and so that they could keep their enslaved people. So convention delegates omitted the words slave and slavery from the Constitution, but included clauses to maintain enslavement of African Americans. South Carolina and Georgia are two states that are examples of sort of fighting back against abolishing slavery. And so they said they would not tolerate a government that stopped citizens from importing slaves. So they created a compromise within the convention by not ending the slave trade until 1808, which I mentioned. So you had the most or the majority of slaves and enslaved Africans coming into the new nation between that period and 1808. You have a lot of people who are brought in after that period as well, who were smuggled into the country or pirated into the country or sold in by other illegal means. And the Constitution included clauses to counteract slave rebellions and escapes. And one of those such clauses was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. And so this act basically gave people free reign over Black bodies. I think that's the best way to say it. It basically said that if you found someone who was an escaped slave, you could return them or you should return them by law to their owners. Now, did people know where people came from? Sometimes, not always. Did 3 Black people in the North get caught up and sold into the slave trade? Absolutely. So the law itself was not it was not helpful to African Americans, but it was definitely helpful in maintaining that slave trade and maintaining the rights of slaveholders. The Constitution also created a 3/5 clause. So by 3/5 clause, it is a compromise between the North and the South that basically counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a human being. And this was for purposes of having voting rights. The South was less densely populated than the North. And so as a compromise, they were able to count, except for, let me say that again. The South was less densely populated than the North in terms of free people, right? And white citizens, essentially. And so they made this compromise to say that you can count your enslaved people, but you can only count them as 3/5 of a human being. And so the slaveholders were happy about that because they could then take the slave population and count it toward their votes, which would count in the electoral college. This is also very interesting for lots of reasons, but it's the first um, kind of place that we see a legal code that strips enslaved Africans of their humanity, right? We know that slavery as an institution stripped Africans of their humanity by practice, but this is now legally in the books. This is part of the Constitution. And it really does then also give the South a lot of voting power to maintain that institution, which also helped maintain their economy. The South, before the Civil War, um, had the fourth largest economy in the world, which made the American economy the 11th largest in the world, all from enslaved population. All right. Um, right. So I just mentioned the antebellum period, and just to let you all kind of think about the antebellum period was a period between 1820 and roughly 1860, at least before the war, so before the Civil War. And this was a time where you saw a lot of fighting in the country between the North and the South, a lot of arguing over freedom, slavery, the institution of slavery, not so much the rights for enslaved people, but the institution of slavery itself. And this ultimately ends in the Civil War. The American Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865. The North won the Civil War, but the South believed that they won the Civil War, and they, to this day, have bumper stickers and things that say the South shall rise again, or things like that. He's actually won. Just it's interesting things, I guess, to say it the least. Um, and out of the Civil War came another kind of version or revising of the Constitution, and those were the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendments that came out of the period of this instruction, which follows the Civil War. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except for in the punishment of affirmation. I'll let that sit for a minute and you can think about that. And I want you to think about it, especially when you think about our incarcerated populations and how that goes back to the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment allowed citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, and it also gave equal protection under the law. And this is really important because this is the argument that we hear today that we see with ICE, not just with our Latina communities, but also with our Black communities. But the 14th Amendment gives citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. That is something that our government is currently trying to reverse. And the 15th Amendment in 1870 allowed for all male citizens of the United States the right to vote. The problem with the 15th Amendment, and I think Dr. Cotter is going to talk about it a little bit, is that the right to vote was not extended to Black men. Very, very few Black men. Initially, there were lots of Black men who voted, and that was immediately stripped away. And then over the next 95 years, you have a struggle and a fight to secure the right to vote for not just Black men, but Black women as well. And so that's kind of an historical background that I wanted to share. I know it was a lot, but I think it's really important for us to think about how these rights came about, the longer struggle that people had in trying to secure these rights. And even when they become legalized, we're going to find very quickly they don't, right? As soon as you get it, it gets stripped away. And then you have to also think about all of the hypocrisy and all of the peculiarities of these ideas of freedom and also enslavement or the institution of slavery. But all of these ideas that this country essentially was founded on. But what does that mean for people of African descent? So hopefully from this brief historical background, you're able to understand that yes, there were some rights that were won a given, except that they actually didn't play it out. eh, Excuse me, either in the way that they were intended or they were not intended to play out in the way that we would like them to. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Crowder.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out this late at night. I appreciate you being here. Thank you, Dr. Grills, for the introduction. And thank you, Dr. Campbell, for that great sort of primer for the conversation that I'm going to get into now. And so I'm going to sort of pick us where we left off with the passage as the 13th, 14th, and 15th and Amen. So as I kind of thought about what I would discuss here, there were a few animating quotes that came to mind. So first, this pretty well-known quote by Frederick Douglass, what to the American slaves is the 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. And so as we think about this, all of the sort of celebrations that are happening this year surrounding the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, I think it's important to consider and to grapple with who's celebrating that and who regularly celebrates the day anyway. So I also Googled Black people in the 4th of July. And there were a lot of things that came up. Here's one of the images I saw on Google Images. Never forget Black people were enslaved on July 4th, 1776. So again, what does this day really mean to the descendants of enslaved Americans? And what can we kind of learn from our history, but also very much the present conditions of Black people and this sort of contested citizenship that they had here? A book that I engaged with when I was in grad school called Democracy in Black: How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul. The sort of central concept or theory offered by this book is this idea of the value gap. A quote from the book by Eddie Glaude says, Black folk never aspired to be the moral conscience of the nation, even as Black leaders shouted it from the rooftops. It just happened to be the case that our actual lives rested in the gap between who America said it was as a democracy and how we actually live. So when I think about the 4th of July and the commemoration of the Declaration of Independence, what comes to mind to me is this idea of the value gap. The Declaration of Independence espouses these ideas of liberty, justice, and equality for all. But there's a clear exception, right? In that slavery is not mentioned, as Dr. Campbell noted. So how do we sort of adjudicate this? And also, it's created this sort of situation in which Black people truly do reveal the sort of contradictions that exist in this document and the reality of this country for many Americans. Okay, so let's go back a little bit. Throughout this talk, I'm going to focus on Black people's inclusion and our exclusion from the political system. So if we go back in time, African-American political participation dates back to the inception of colonial America in 1619. In 1661, slavery became a formal institution that restricted the political activities of enslaved people. And the fine line between freed and enslaved Black people disappeared, and Virginia withdrew suffrage from all Black people in 1723. So I think one thing that often happens as we think about American history is that it feels like these inequalities were inevitable. And it feels like it was always this way, that Black people never has the right to vote. When in fact, if we go back to, early sort of colonial America, some Black people were initially included. But then they were intentionally excluded from the system and intentionally excluded from the right to vote. So again, I want to keep in mind that this exclusion is a policy choice and that it was not inevitable. It didn't have to be this way. Okay, so we'll fast forward now to the Reconstruction era. So during the 1870s, more than a dozen African-American men, many of whom had been born into slavery, were elected to U.S. Congress. During that same period of time, there were 2 Black men elected to the United States Senate representing the state of Mississippi. And prior to 2025, there have never been more than 3 Black senators in office sitting at one time. So now it's a record number because now there are 5. But again, that was as a whole group by. So we can see how there was this brief opening, right, in the Reconstruction era where Black people had the right to vote. They were enfranchised, they had political power. And in that very short period of time, were quickly able to make, pretty monumental and huge gains that it's now taken, you know, um, over 200 years to even get close to again. Okay, so following Reconstruction, we go into the era of Jim Crow, and we have massive voter suppression. There's voter suppression through violence, through poll taxes, through literacy tests. And I'm sure that many of you have taken a look at some of these questions on literacy tests. I, as like a PhD in political science, could not pass the literacy test. Okay, the questions asked here are like, civics, you know, 5,000 level course questions. Okay, and so they were very much designed to make it so that you know no one could really sort of surpass these expectations. And so in the midst of, Jim Crow segregation and voter suppression, Black people continue to fight for the right to vote. And so one thing that we see that is persistent across time is that Black people have always been placed in a position to have to kind of fight for their citizenship and inclusion. And so we see that fight through protest, through sit-ins. The March on Washington is a monumental protest. And then also in 1964, we had the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was led by Ella Baker and Fannie Hamer. Fannie Hamer said, if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. And so the reason for the creation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was that at that time in Mississippi, the Democratic Party held white-only primary. And so there was no way for Black voters to be considered at the primary level. And that was the only sort of content that mattered, right? And so even though there was still so much voter suppression that they faced when going to the ballot, they couldn't get their candidates even listed on the ballot. And again, thinking back to the Reconstruction era where we had 2 Black senators seated was in Mississippi. Fast forward, to 1964, and they can't vote in primaries. They can't have candidates sit on the ballot. So after, almost a century of advocacy, we get the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So this was an act of enforcement of the 15th Amendment. So again, we talked about the creation of the 15th Amendment, but it was basically null and void until 1965. And at that time, Black men and women were given access to the ballot. So this act aimed to eliminate poll taxes and literacy tests and prevented Black people from voting. And it required federal oversight of registration and pre-clearance for changes to voting laws in covered jurisdictions. So this is largely in the South. Several years later, it expanded to cover states that have large numbers of language minorities, so like New Mexico and Arizona. So the Voting Rights Act had really consequential effects for Black American as well as other American colonies. Here I have my great-grandfather's voter registration card. I don't know when I took a picture of this or how I had it in my phone, but I just, there's so many things that I don't realize about the changes and the updates to Apple. And oh my gosh, the severity is so ours. 8D or to my advances in making these slides because I just typed in my grandfather's head and there got that. So this was my great-grandfather's, my grandmother, Catherine Crowder's father, Morris Pulliam. And this is something that is like a family heirloom, that's been passed down over generation because of the hard-fought efforts to have access to the ballot. And so at the time, he lived in Gary, Indiana. And it's interesting to think about the sort of history that, we draw from when we think about our access to the ballot. And also what knowing that history does to us in our own civic engagement. What does it mean to be constantly told that your ancestors fought for your right to vote in terms of how we interact with the political system? We fast forward to now. Indiana there's been a redistricting plan that could leave Gary residents without a voice in Congress. So Gary is the place that has the largest concentration of Black people in the state, where they're able to still elect members to Congress. However, currently in the Supreme Court, the ruling will come out in June, which with Louisiana v. Callett, that will determine whether or not Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act will be gutted. And so Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act has already been gutted. I'll talk about that next. But Section 2 could allow for things like this to occur. Okay, so rewinding a little bit to 2013, that's when the Supreme Court for Shelby v. Boulder. So this gutted the Voting Rights Act and opened the doors for states to enact or reenact restrictive voting laws. It put an end to preclearance. And so, those southern states or states with large numbers of language minorities no longer had to get permission in order to change laws with regard to where polling locations exist and voter ID laws. Here's a quote from the Brennan Center. The same day that Shelby v. Boulder was ruled, Texas officials announced that they would implement the nation's most restrictive voter ID law, which had previously been blocked in the preclearance process. That law, which a court later ruled to be racially discriminatory, was the first of a massive wave of restrictive voting policies implemented in jurisdictions previously subject to preclearance. At least 29 states have passed 94 laws that make it more difficult to vote, particularly in community color. So fast forward to the current political moment. Voting is harder. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the actual real law in Georgia that makes it illegal to give water to people in line waiting to vote. California is one of the easiest places in the world to vote. You can do same-day registration. You can vote by mail. You can not have registered in your life, show up to a polling place and vote. But in many places across this country, it's much harder. Okay. Another form of disenfranchisement that I think is important to talk about, particularly as we kind of close the loop with what was last said. Dr. Campbell said the 13th Amendment abolished slavery except in the punishment of a crime. And so right now, there are 4 million people who are denied voting rights due to felony conviction. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow popularized this idea that these sort of rules around mass incarceration have allowed for the introduction of a new form of slavery for Black Americans. And so, again, this idea of slavery and the Declaration, it feels distant and historical, but in many ways, it is a very contemporary issue. I also wanted to talk about this theory developed by a political scientist, Mian B. Carter, conflicted nativism. She states, I argue that the result of necessary and repeated protest activity on the part of Blacks has not only yielded greater political inclusion for them, but it has produced a sense of racial insecurity. Black people in this country have contested citizenship, and this contestation persists over time. There's never really a sense of security in our place in the United States. And so thinking of where we are in this current moment and where we go from here, there is still so much fighting that has to be done, and our citizenship continues to be contested. I want it to end with this quote by James Baldwin: "I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize from this perpetuated." Thank you.
Okay, so I have the pleasure, the honor, or the difficult task of concluding this. And I'm gonna start with, I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer. I do not hate America. I love America. My family helped build this country, but America has not been nice, to put it mildly. America has not operated with transparency. America has done bait and switch on so many occasions when it comes to Black folk and people of color that I think we've all lost counts. And if America is ever going to be who she professes to be, she's going to have to come to terms with some of the inconsistencies. So my comments are really centered around grounding us in the contradictions of America as it relates to the Declaration of Independence and beyond, and the absurdity of the Declaration of Independence and our so called founding fathers, and therefore the need for repair, the need for honesty. You know, everybody talks about Epstein file, Epstein file. Well, I'm wondering whether or not Thomas Jefferson wasn't his Epstein files era person, as he forced himself upon a 14-year-old girl who then he tried to suggest that this was an equal relationship. This is the hard conversation we have. And he was 43. And he was 43, absolutely. And what 14-year-old in her right mind wants a 43-year-old man? I'm just saying, all right? And I say the need for repair is essential to this conversation. As one reparations organization puts it, you stole us, you sold us, you owe us. I'm gonna say that again. It's really just that simple. You stole us, you sold us, you owe us. So with that, let me be a start. So Dr. Du Bois really nailed it. He said, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again toward enslavement. We have never been free in this country, let alone beneficiaries of the Declaration of Independence. If you don't understand that, then everything else you think you understand will simply confuse you, as Neely Fuller would say, right? And Baldwin also said, people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. We are in a vicious cycle of a trapped history that America just won't get the gumption to face honestly, squarely, and then do the repair that's necessary. So our past is in fact our present, right? Racism and denial of rights is built into the DNA of this country. It's built in. It's so built in. It's so baked in that people aren't even aware of when not only is it happening, but when they're colluding with it. I'm always struck by, I'm a psychologist, so I watch people. I watch what they say, how they say it, what they do, what they don't do. The subtle things in like a twitch of an eye or when they look away when they're explaining something. And I'm always astounded by how this country goes into all these like matrix level gyrations to avoid the truth. And the fact that not only is this racism baked into the DNA, but that we all collude with it, including Black people. Sometimes, right? We collude with the madness. And so if we're ever going to be the America that the Declaration professes and that the Constitution suggests, we got to deal with this. So the beginning of paragraph 2 of the Declaration, and by the way, if you really want to know how they struggled and did the matrix gyrations, go look at the sections that Jefferson took out to him, right? That dealt with slavery. But then go and read some of the scholars' analysis of just the psychological insanity that they went through trying to justify, explain away, reshape and reformulate basic thing, and how they did something that Freud would say, oh, that's a definite example of projection, right? So part of what the founding fathers were suggesting, I'm getting ahead of myself. See, I can't stick to script. Is this notion that, Black people are hypersexual and that all Black men want white women. Truth be told, they were over-sexualized and they wanted Black women, but they couldn't accept that, so they projected that onto us. There are so many examples of that. And unfortunately, the American Psychological Association won't study American racism at that level. But if they did, they could have really helped move this country along. So the beginning paragraph said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Really? Well, Black people didn't get the memo. Indigenous folk didn't get the memo. Women didn't get the memo. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men and women, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Feels like America's really kind of rolled that back right now in 2026 because it's not suiting the interests of land-owning, wealthy white men. Okay. You may not agree with my assessment, but I'm speaking my truth as I see. Central figures of the American Revolution, like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and George Washington, advocated and fought for freedom for the colonies, yet they all practiced enslavement. In fact, Jefferson himself enslaved more than 600 people in his lifetime. And though the Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal, 1/5 of the population were enslaved, and 1/3 of the Declaration signers were personally enslavers. You see the problem that they were dealing with? It was creating cognitive dissonance. That's a basic intro psych concept. When you experience cognitive dissonance, it means your system cannot be in a sense of balance because something is not adding up. So then you have to do something to create the balance. In some instances, particularly as it relates to politics in the United States, those remedies involve lying, cheating, conniving, backstabbing, shape-shifting, and all other sorts of things. So we face the hard irony that Jefferson, Washington, Madison, and other Southerners owned and sold Black people. And Adams, and he was not alone, opposed enslavement, but at the time he was so transfixed by the grandeur of America's assertion of its independence, not the distance of many from its affirmation. So by failing in the 1770s to confront the discrepancy between the Declaration and human bondage, Jefferson and others, Du Bois said, postponed and made worse the bloody reckoning between North and South that occurred in the 1860s. So the Declaration did not include or protect Black people, the indigenous community, or women. Yet, the Declaration has become a powerful symbol of American identity and political culture. We've been going around the world saying, look at us. This is how you do it. No, it's not. It's just not. And equality that in its 250 years that's proposed in this declaration has not been brought into real practice. For many of us, the people of color, it's fictional. Yet we want it. We deserve it. We're human beings. We have a right to it. So while signed in 1776, it wasn't until 89 years later, in 1865, that I call them scraps of the Declaration were extended to its captured enslaved Africans. Not until 1964, 188 years later, did we get codified inclusion for those who were supposed to be beneficiaries of the tenets of the Declaration. With each step forward to inclusion, America pressed into action tactics to take us back into our position of substandard second-class citizen. And today I intentionally wore this sweatshirt because my ancestors, our ancestors, demand that we tell the truth and we understand the assignment, right? Their voices are no longer here physically, but they're here through us. And at some point, someone has to stand up and tell the truth. Even in the face of those who would want to silence us, jail us, what's those other words? Get rid of us, yeah, discard. Yeah, you get the point, right? So key aspects of the Declaration, right? It excluded us from citizenship. It was full of contradictions, declaring equality when it wasn't really being bestowed equally. Actionable ideals emerged, like people like Frederick Douglass and later Dr. King framed the Declaration as a promissory note to hold the nation up accountable. It is a promissory note that the U.S. has still to come to terms with and to pay up. And it involves issues around self-emancipation. During the Revolution, tens of thousands of Black people took the promise of liberty into their own hands by escaping enslavement, arguing that the principles of the Revolution applied to them, not just their so-called masters. So the Declaration functioned as a living document that Black America compelled the nation to align with. And as I mentioned earlier, look at some of the early writings, look at some of the analysis by political scientists and historians about Jefferson and the drafting of the Declaration. You will not be amused and you will see all of the contradictions. I had more to say on that, but time's not on my side. So the contradiction between words and actions allow for the Declaration to create future, even worse conditions. Example, the enslaved population, numbering 700,000 in 1790, had grown dramatically by 1860. So where, fast forward after the so-called declarations, what did it do? The total number of enslaved for the lower South was up to 2,300,000. The total of enslaved upper South, 1,200,000. The total number of border states, 432,000. In other words, that so-called declaration had an opposite effect for Black folk. It made us in worse conditions than when there was no declaration. Think about that. Worse than when there was no declaration. Hamilton asked a crucial question in the Federalist #1 that continues to poke at the conscience of America to this day. He asked whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. That really is an appropriate reflection in this day and time. So the absurdity and the contradictions are just like they were slapping me in the faces. I actually got overwhelmed. I had to make myself get up and get away from the computer and just stop, because it was just, the deeper I went down that rabbit hole, the worse and worse it got. But consider this contradiction. More than 50% of U.S. presidents from 1789 to 1885 enslaved African Americans. And so what you see there is the first 21 presidents seated together in the White House, the enslavers are shaded in red. So it's not hard to understand why we have all this contradiction. They would have had to give up some of their wealth. They would have had to come to terms with the immorality of their behavior. Oh, this sounds familiar today. With the wealthy folks who are running not just our country, the darn world. Yeah, bro. So, okay. Okay, I'm gonna skip all of this. I have more to say, but the question is not what did enslavement do, but rather what is it still doing to harm Black America? Because we want to talk about it as the past. Some people want to make it the distant past. But if I can talk about members of my family who were enslaved, members of my family who, and your family, who could not vote, My grandfather, bless his heart, being called a bag boy on the census, then no, this is not what happened. This is what is still happening. So Brian Smedley hypothesizes about reparative strategies because the damage is still happening. And he brings in for consideration the importance of understanding not just the damage to Black body in the moment of enslavement and then post-enslavement Jim Crow and all kinds of denial of rights, but then the consequences for health, for wealth generation, et cetera, et cetera. And I have to do this aside. Okay. Y'all have been watching the news, right? In the news, you are now hearing in relationship to the awful, awful behavior of ICE and how it's treating Latinos and other communities of color, because they're not just going after Latinos, right? And the damage, the trauma that is inflicting on the children that are swept up in this, either because they have been removed and they're in detention or they've been watching their parents, right? And they have all these experts coming on talking about the trauma impact and, the damage that this is going to do across that lifespan of that child, how it's going to impact the family dynamics and then the community. And I'm sitting there saying, you're finally getting what we've been trying to tell you for generations about what this country has been doing to Black people and Black families and Black communities. The very instances of trauma that are described as instances, they are from cradle to grave for us across generations. And what Smedley and others are pointing to is, hey, there's a generational consequence in terms of health. And there is a consequence in terms of how people are treated when they go for medical care. I kid you not, when I go to a doctor who I've not seen before, I have 2 or 3 sweatshirts and t-shirts that all say the same thing. It has like a lip and then a check mark on one of the options on the list. Miss, Mrs., doctor. And the check box is on doctor. And I want them to see that, to say, don't play with me. You're talking to someone who has intelligence, who reads medical journals, and who has probably studied up on her condition more than you have on recent research and on publications, right? Interesting fact. Who notices those t-shirts and sweatshirts? Other patients in the waiting room, maybe a nurse or two. I have yet to have a doctor acknowledge. Yet. Yeah. All right. Okay. Oh no, I got 2 minutes. Okay, so what can I say? I yield my time. Oh, that's all. You gave me a compliment. I can take 3 more extra minutes. Okay. So the hypocrisy of Jefferson and the Declaration is dizzying. Example, the logic on the one hand that equality to which white men were naturally born could be extended to women and enslaved Black people has never been reconciled. Instead, the list of who doesn't qualify just seems to be growing. There's so many examples that I could go into, but if you look at, and I brought this for dramatic effect. This is the final report of the California Reparations Task Force. All 1,100 pages about California, primarily. Just California. Yeah. So if this is California, we need something that can hold a book that will take up the space of this room to talk about the United States. And so what did that enslavement do? What were some of the consequences? You got enslavement. Babies were enslaved at birth for their entire lives and for the entire lives of their children and their children's children. Again, remember what I said about the news coverage. An instant here, an instant there. And we're talking about a multi-generational, uninterrupted assault on the Black psyche, the Black body, the Black soul, all right? That enslavement, the foundation of America's wealth, has been built upon trafficked African people and their descendants, built on their forced labor, and their bodies were bought and sold as commodities. And in fact, we treat dogs better than enslaved Africans. We treat dogs better, right? And what's that? The activist, animal activist, PETA. Do you know they had the audacity to compare the treatment of dogs with enslavement? They they took that stuff down so bad because the fury of black anger and outrage that how dare you? How dare you? Now I love dogs, but I'm sorry. I'm several notches beyond dog level. Okay. So racial terror. That's another part of this equation that the founding I have a hard time calling the founding fathers. I'm sorry. That gang of folk. Because in some respects, they were a group of wealthy gang members. Right? I mean, let's just take what they throw at us and just whiz it on back around. All right? What they were. Yeah, exactly. So one of the ways that they're able to accomplish what they've been able to accomplish is racial terror. We've developed an entire chapter to explaining how racial terror was used. If we were allowed to actually learn our history, what is being used right now in terms of racial and political terror would not have been able to gain the traction that it had because people would have known the playbook well enough. We also talk about housing segregation, which was rampant in the United States. But guess what? It was rampant right here in California. We have sundown towns, up and down. That means if you're black, once the sun goes down, you best not be in that town because you could be jailed or killed or beaten mercilessly, right? And so that housing segregation thing was huge here. And if they couldn't get their way with using different policies, guess what they would do? Who knows about Section 14 in Palm Springs? And at the see? Yeah, you know, because you were. Right. But this is an example of, if you don't know history, it's going to come back and bite you. So in Palm Springs, they decided that was prime territory. And there was a settlement area that was inhabited by African Americans, indigenous community, and Latinx community. And they were living in harmony with one another. Their descendants are still there, and they're fighting for reparation. What did they do to get the land from them? They gave them less than a day's notice and told them, get out, take all your stuff out. If you don't, too bad on you, we're going to burn it down. And then the mayor and the fire department went to that community and burnt them out. The fire department. This is where I get to the absurdity of it all. So you had separate and unequal education. So when you look at that, only 8% of American high school seniors could identify enslavement as the central cause of the Civil War. 40% of African American K-12 teachers believe that genetics is a slight factor in explaining why white students do better in school than black students. I can't even say any more on that one. Mental and physical harm and neglect, another huge one. Even when our bodies were now no longer, quote unquote, living, they could not rest. They would dig up our graves, sell them to the highest bidding medical school, and then use them for dissection. They still do, yes. And then you have the wealth gap. For example, if you look at the median wealth for singles, white men, $28,000, black men, $300. White women, $15,640, black women, $200. The wealth gap was the same today as it had been 2 years before the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. In other words, there is no progress being had. In 2019, the median Black household had a net worth of $24,100. For white household, $188,000. For me, a burning question is, why haven't we as Black people gone stark raving mad? How is it that we are able to still hold on to our sensibility, our sense of community, our sense of social justice, our sense of we're all in this together? And if if I'm doing well and another group is not doing well, I'm not doing well, right? How is it that we've been able to do that, right? And this wealth gap persists across all income levels. So I'm going to, end by saying that the California Assembly Bill 3121 is established in recognition of the fact that it wasn't just what happened in enslavement, it's the ongoing continued harms to this very day. And that bill essentially demanded that we list out the harm, that we understand the machinations of how they work, how those harms are still perpetuated today, and what are the forms of repair. And so I was going to show you a little clip. I'll just show you maybe 2 minutes and end with that. But these are members of the task force speaking to KQED News right after one of our hearings.
It day in and day out, you are told repeatedly, you're not a human being, you are not intelligent, you are not beautiful, you don't know how to raise your children, you're a criminal. The list goes on and on. If you're getting steady doses of that, even the best Black family is going to struggle to offset those messages.
Fight, stay, push, kick, punch, move.
On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was murdered, and that triggered the largest protest in U.S. history. By September of 2020, the legislature acted to pass Shirley Weber's bill creating a California task force. We had 3 goals that we had to do. One was to document the harm of enslavement, Jim Crow, exclusion, and connect the dots between that and today's consequences. Second thing is to find ways to educate the American public over this history that's really been erased. Third requirement is to make recommendations.
We're really a study group to come up with recommendations to give to the legislature. Then we'll hopefully pass that on to the governor. Hopefully the governor will sign it.
On June 1st, 2022, the California Reparations Task Force issued its nearly 500-page interim report to the state legislature.
The report lays out the deep history of extraordinary racism and exclusion that African Americans have faced since day one.
You will read some things in here that you would thought that only happened in the South. That chattel slavery and the aftermath of the Jim Crow, redlining, all of that just moved west.
Fact of the matter is, the American public knows little about it.
The disparities in outcomes that we're seeing in terms of wealth, health, education, access are not about being a Black people did rule, but it's about a system that has actually been designed to keep Black people at the bottom.
The task force uses the international law definition of reparations, which consists of 5 forms.
It's about how do you restore the victim group to a position before the harm was done. So compensation is one of those forms, so cash payments or money. Second form is rehabilitation, free health care, free social services, free legal services, for instance. Restitution is the third form of reparation. So stolen land, stolen property, real or intellectual. The fourth form of reparations is satisfaction. And that really gets some more symbolic forms for reparations, like a formal apology or the taking down of
Confederate monuments in this country, similar to denazification in Germany. And then lastly, the fifth form of reparations under international law is guarantees of non-repetition. So that gets at more structural and institutional policy change.
We have an interim report that organized principally around 12 areas. And so we're focusing on the kind of financial compensation around 5 out of the 12.
And so to wrap up, reparations needs to include a counteroffensive that protects us, because, quite frankly, the Declaration nor the Constitution is doing its job. And there are 5 major pillars that maintain the anti-Black assault: religions, governance, corporations, universities, and media. Sorry, you're on the list. Under the category broadly writ large of media, any of universities. And so that reparations idea is to help Black folk reconstitute personal and collective identity, defined by them, not by people who disrespect and disparage us. So that is all for them. So maybe we could get the lights so our audience isn't in the dark. And let me okay, can you go through those moments too?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So while Dr. Drills is going through the questions, I will make 2 really quick announcements. The first is that tomorrow at 10 a.m. in LSB 120, there will be a keynote address, a form of response to Jesuit slaveholding. And so there will be people from the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation. So that's tomorrow at 10 a.m. And then on Friday, February 13th, Friday from Mines as well, we're celebrating Douglas Day, Frederick Douglass Day. So a lot of you may not know that Black History Month was chosen, February was chosen for Black History Month because it marks the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And so when Carter's U would have been founded, the N-word history, it was founded in February for honoring Frederick Douglass and Abraham. Oh, wait, what's the name? It's so cool. So the Marymount Institute is co-hosting and co-sponsored with the Departments of History and African American Studies. Douglas Day event is happening all over the country, and it's a transcribe-a-thon, and we will be working on transcribing pieces of the Colored Conventions project. And the Colored Conventions were groups of people that met between the 1830s and 40s and forward, and really pushed to advocate for abolishing slavery. So we will be at the very now Switchy on Friday on night the 12th. So come by, do a little transcription, get some snack. Pastor Robin, there's gonna be snack. Yeah, you don't have to be there for the 3 hours.
Okay, so the first question that I will read is, if America, no, sorry, that wasn't the woman. Ready to go. Little bishop. Oh, okay. Okay, what advice would you give young Black women who want to get more involved in politics?
I think there's a lot that you can do. I remember one of the things I did when I first wanted to get like more involved in local politics. And now I think back and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. But I was living in Harlem, and it was I've always been interested in politics my entire life, but this is just one sort of very concrete thing. After Donald Trump's election, I was like, okay, I want to get more involved in local politics in an official capacity. And so in New York, what we had these things called community board. And your community board is basically like, there was a committee that I was on, it was libraries and school. And so, for example, if a new school in your community wants to, like a charter school wants to come in and be co-located in the River Bay, or if a library wants to make any change, if a bar wants to open on your street, they need the approval of community members in order to move forward with things like that. They're looking at hyper local positions that you can take. But beyond being involved in an official capacity, I think something that's really important in the current moment is there's two things. So one, just being in TZ, like in real life. So being there in this space and, having these conversations, I think is an important first step. So many of us know that we're in these like online echo chamber and that he becomes so individualized. We talk about, this Putnam's idea of bowling alone, we're isolated. You have less poor conversation. So putting yourselves in a position where you're actually in third spaces talking to people. But also I think it's really important on the left that we continue to organize. I talked in class today about a study done by Philippified Jay Grumbach, Boy Warren, and Kari Han, where they looked at the effect of organizing in the project on voter turnout. And they found that when you go into a community project and you talk to people about, the importance of voting, what's on the ballot, what's happening in the community, it did lead to a meaningful increase in turnout. And so thinking about, local organizations that you can get involved in that will place you in community and conversation with people and meaningful way back at that data.
So, Dr. Campbell, based on the history of of its founding, can the U.S. ever achieve racial equality and/or justice under this Constitution?
I love that question. Can? Yes. Will? Not. That's the short answer. Can we based on our own history? What we're seeing right now is a fight against that change. Right? Like all of you, all of us, we are living through this massive, massive fight to keep things the way they are. So as long as we allow that to happen, if we allow that to happen, if we stop fights, if we just give up, then things will never change and we'll just be stuck in this situation. So can we? Yeah, but it takes all of us. It takes all of us. And I think what this country has seen, at least over the past almost 20 year framework, is that and everyone knows this, every politician knows that when people unite, it doesn't bode well for one side, and it bodes very, very well for us, right? So if we were all united together, if we work together, if we fought for each other, if we did all the things that we've already talked about here today, if we helped each other get registered to vote, if we went to polling places, if we selected people at local levels, state levels, and national levels that were aligned with our beliefs, if we force people to live up to representing us, we the people who voted them into office, and we the people who can vote people out of office, we can do it. The question is, will we or do we have the will? And I can't answer that.
So another question is, and I'll take this one. It's going to be a short answer. If slavery was one of our original sins, how do we bring about forgiveness and wash this sin away? Have you ever had a friend or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a partner say, "I'm sorry," and you say, "For what?" And they're like, "Whatever it is that you're mad at me about." Are you ready to forgive? Absolutely not. So forgiveness, Black folk, our humanity sometimes is like on overdrive. And we are ready to forgive so quickly before we have even allowed ourselves to grieve whatever it is, like, with the Charleston. Yeah. I mean, before the dust settled, the Black families who lost someone to Dylan Roof's madness, right, were already forgiving him. So forgiveness presumes that there's some understanding of the wrong that occurred. Not just a superficial, but a real deep understanding and a commitment to guarantees of non-repetition, that you won't do it again, right? So when we have some of those elements in place, then we can talk about forgiveness, and then we can talk about the sins being washed away. But I actually don't want them to be washed away. We need to remember, so that it doesn't happen again, right? And and we've been like sounding the clarion. I said this was gonna be fast. No. But we have this idea that when it comes to dealing with some of these issues, we can forgive and move on. We forgive and move on without really interrogating fully what happened, and then somehow encapsulating that into the memory banks, the psyche of the society, so that it doesn't happen again. And we've been trying to sound the alarm. You know that saying, first they came for us, next they'll come for you? We've been saying that, right? In this Trump era. And finally, and we were saying, everybody, white America, you too. Be careful. If they come for us, they'll come for you. And now they've come. It doesn't matter if you're white. It doesn't matter if you're a white mother. It doesn't matter if you're a white male nurse. You are swept up. So no, let's not wash it away. Let's make sure, just as much as we talk about the 4th of July, which I can't stand that holiday. I go up and down my street. Why are you celebrating? What are you celebrating? Who? What's this for? What you? And I'm talking to my Asian neighbors, my Latino neighbors, my Black neighbors, and my Canadian neighbors. Especially y'all. You need to not be celebrating this right at this moment. So anyway, another question is, what is today's agenda for supporting and advancing Black and minority voting rights? And why was 1965 so enlightened, yet 2025 is so regressive?
So there's a lot in that question. Let me see it again so I can remember the two cards.
No.
Okay, so what's the agenda? I think that a part of the agenda is what Dr. Girls just said, but that we have to continue to remember our history. I think that that's so important in terms of being able to move forward. I think that we need to activate a sense of political efficacy in our communities. This idea that like our vote matters, our voice matters, we matter in the political system. Because I think it's really easy, especially right now, to kind of feel like, well, it's all going to hell. There's nothing we can do. Things are just as bad now as they ever were. But to be fair, if I remember my history, my great-great-grandfather was playing. Things have improved. Things have gotten better. But also remembering our history, remembering the hard-fought, victories to be able to kind of have access to the ballot, even though we're not where we want to be by a long shot. Remembering that history. And I think also I've been really interested in a lot of political psychology right now that looks at the role of emotion. A lot of people are angry right now. But the angriest people, when you turn on CNN, when you open your phone, yesterday Bad Bunny performed at the Super Bowl, white people are outraged. Okay, their sense of anger is extreme. Meanwhile, I don't know how many Super Bowl halftimes I sat through with Joe Schmo, whoever white man that they love, and I don't remember seeing nearly as many angry people anywhere. And so there's this political scientist, Dad and Ian, and he talked about the anger gap. There's this gap in anger between white and Black Americans. White people get outraged and look at them mobilizing around Trump's election. Things aren't the way they should. They have this sense of entitlement, and because they're entitled, they're angry. But on the other side, he also has a research agenda that examined hope for communities of color and Black people in particular. When Black people become hopeful, that's when we see large swells of turnout and large political mobilization. And so I think that we really need to collectively think about how we can activate hope in our community in this time. And when we think about the difference between 1965 and 2025, I think what we see in 2025 is that people they want us to forget. In 1965, the discrimination and oppression that Black people were experiencing was very visible. And when you think about this sort of broadening, what some white folks and white scholars refer to as the Great Awakening that occurred post 2020. Yeah. Yeah. Real fine. Yeah. There was this Greek opening for communities of color. We thought something was happening. And then we've seen the backlash so quickly to what they have cemented as this awakening. And so I think continuing to be critical, continuing to, but also finding even in your critique,
And so I'm going to try to see if we can get to two last ones, and they'll kick one of you, and then I'll take one, and we'll do our elevator version. But you mainly tap me to do the elevator version. Okay, so how would you change the declaration? What would it look like as it is made today?
Wow. um, well, I think first of all, the declaration needs to be inclusive. It needs that inclusive language, right? So that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all people are treated equal, not men, and not specifically property holding white men, as it was intended. I think that it. You mentioned the halftime show, the only part Super Bowl I watched yesterday, and I was like, that is such a beautiful history that we see, and it's so inclusive. And even if we're just looking at Puerto Rico, um, eh, where the subject matter is inclusive, it's intergenerational, it's, all the different people, the gintos, the hair textures, and all of these things, which we have been seeing with um other Super Bowls last year, Kendrick, all of that, right? So it's very inclusive, and I think that's where we need to focus. But if we were focused that way, I mean, we in this room would probably be, this is great, and this is the country I'm proud to be a partner, proud to be an American, right? And we was built that way. But, um, again, there is like here, I don't want to say we're at war but we are at a war. It's an intellectual war, it's a political war, it's oceanal war. With people trying to preserve exactly those states that the Declaration of Independence guarantees to those initial property to white men. I don't know. I hope that I answered the question. I sound not hopeful about it at all, but I think, I think these would be burned down everywhere. He took the word, burn down Matthew's house.
And so, very quickly, the last question that we have time for: should the Black community and other communities of color expect reparations from the U.S. anytime soon? Should we wait for it to be given, or should it be taken? Well, cameras off. No. The revolution will not be televised. No, so one thing that you should know is that reparations is no longer really centered in the United States. It is truly on a global scale, with some parts of the global village much farther ahead. For example, the Caribbean countries under CARICOM. On the continent of Africa, it is front and center for the African Union, and there's been incredible levels of fact finding and demands being made of Europe. And we even sent a delegation of folks to the Vatican for reckoning with the Pope. Because, Catholic Church was really front and center, in a really significant sort of way. So So should we expect it anytime soon? Well, that depends on how you define soon. Probably not in the next 3 years. But that does not mean that we are not actually very, very hard at work setting the stage. We actually got really far ahead, and we're hopeful that HR 40, which would be the federal version of what we did in California, would see the light of day, and then Trump happened. So not anytime necessarily in the next 2 to 3 years, but definitely there's traction being made, and people are being put on notice, and not just governments, also corporations. Well, not just corporations, also university, not just universities, actually individual wealthy families. And some of I have to give them their kudos. Some of these wealthy white families are stepping up, and they're saying, yeah, you know what? Our wealth is based on. And yeah, that was not right. And yeah, we need to do something to recognize that. And some are actually giving some of their wealth backs, right, to the families that they harm. So I'm hopeful. Will it happen in my lifetime? I get welled up with tears about this. Probably not. But I'm hopeful for my grandson, who by the age of 9, when I asked him, I'm working on a book with a colleague of mine at Yale, and it's basically two grandmothers writing a book for other grandmothers about how to save our children from this. And so we interview our grandsons. Ooh, mine is 9, hers is 7. And so when we kind of come up with an idea, we run it by them and we see what they think. And if it doesn't fly, it doesn't make it in the book. So I asked Caleb one day, I said, Caleb, what race are you? And he looked at me like, that's a stupid question, Nana. And so then he answered me, and I said, have you ever, and he's biracial, he's Honduran and Black. And I said, have you ever experienced anybody treating you different because you're Black or you're Latino? And he looked at me and he gave me that same, like, that's a stupid question, Nana. And so his response was, yeah, a bunch of times. It took everything in me not to burst into tears in front of him. That a 9-year-old tells me a bunch of times he has been treated differently because he is Black and Latino. No child should have to deal with that. And so that is, in fact, the assignment, that we have yet to protect our children, our babies, from missing family. And Cheryl. Hey, you did.